Reason is not what we think it is. It is not a tool we casually use. It is the force that shapes how we exist. It cuts through illusion. It demands that we see not what comforts us, but what is. Before the world learned to worship abstraction, Aristotle had already turned his gaze downward. When others searched for truth in distant ideals, he stepped into the raw surface of life. He observed, he compared, he concluded, not from hope, but from what is present. This was not just philosophy. This was a rupture. Before we continue, you are gently invited to subscribe, leave a like, and share a comment. This channel is a small space for grounding and reflection, created for those who seek a calmer way of understanding themselves and the world. If you feel comfortable, tell us where you are and what time it is for you. Your presence here matters, and your words help weave a quiet community across the distance. May what follows bring you ease, clarity, and a softer place to rest your thoughts. Aristotle reveals something uncomfortable. Truth does not wait in perfection. It hides in imperfection. It exists in what we can touch, measure, and question. And here is the sharper question. If truth is already in front of us, why do we keep looking away? Modern life in 2025 has not escaped this tension. We have more data, more speed, more noise, yet we still avoid the act of truly seeing. We replace observation with assumption. We replace thinking with reaction. This is where the fracture begins, between what is and what we choose to believe. And from this fracture, Aristotle builds his entire philosophy, not upward into fantasy, but downward into reality. Now we enter the body of that descent. Truth does not live in the sky. It hides in what is already here, already present, already ignored. Before the world learned to worship abstraction, Aristotle had already turned his back on the heavens, while his teacher Plato reached upward toward a realm of perfect forms. He stepped downward into the dust of reality. This was not a rejection of truth. It was a redefinition of where truth must be found. He did not believe that essence lived somewhere beyond life. He believed it was embedded within life itself. And that single shift split philosophy into two directions that still divide the human mind today. What does it mean to abandon the ideal for the real? It means to confront what is in front of you without escape. It means to accept that truth is not waiting in a distant perfection, but is tangled in imperfection, in movement, in contradiction. Aristotle did not search for a world untouched by change. He demanded that we understand change itself. The first rupture is this: truth is not elsewhere, it is here. The explanation follows with force. Plato saw the physical world as a shadow, a flawed copy of a higher reality. Aristotle saw that view as an evasion. If everything we touch is dismissed as inferior, then knowledge becomes a form of denial. He rejected that denial. He argued that substance, the thing itself, is not a broken reflection. It is the starting point. The misunderstanding is common and persistent. People assume that seeking higher truth requires rejecting the concrete. Aristotle destroys that illusion. To know anything, you must begin with what exists, not with what you wish existed. And so the conclusion lands hard. Philosophy does not ascend first, it observes. The second rupture cuts deeper. Knowledge is not inherited, it is built. Aristotle did not trust revelation, he trusted examination. He believed that the mind must earn its conclusions by engaging with the world, not by escaping it. This is where his method emerges with precision. Look before you believe. Compare before you conclude. Break things down. Study their parts. Study their causes. The nature of a thing is revealed through its behavior, not through ideal speculation. The common misunderstanding is that observation is simple. It is not. It demands discipline. It demands patience. It demands the courage to admit that what you thought might be wrong. And the conclusion is unavoidable. Truth is not given, it is extracted. The third rupture is existential. To return to reality is to lose comfort. Plato offers certainty in perfection. Aristotle offers uncertainty in existence. When you ground truth in the real, you accept that knowledge is always incomplete. You accept that understanding evolves. You accept that error is not an accident, but a condition. This is not a weakness in his philosophy. It is its brutal honesty. The misunderstanding here is dangerous. Many believe that philosophy should provide final answers. Aristotle denies that desire. He shows that thinking is a process, not a destination. And the conclusion cuts clean. To think is to remain unfinished. Now look at the modern mind, surrounded by data, drowned in information, yet still desperate for illusion. Today, people claim to be rational, yet they cling to abstractions more seductive than anything Plato imagined. Ideologies replace observation. Narratives replace evidence. The surface of reality is filtered, edited, distorted, until it becomes unrecognizable. We do not ascend to truth, we curate it, and in doing so, we repeat the very escape Aristotle resisted. Modernity does not solve the problem of illusion, it industrializes it. Why do we resist the real? Because the real is unstable. It shifts. It contradicts. It exposes our ignorance. To face reality is to face limitation. And the human mind resists limitation more than anything else. It prefers certainty, even false certainty, over ambiguity. This is the psychological core. We do not reject reality because it is unclear. We reject it because it threatens our sense of control. Aristotle forces a confrontation. He strips away the comfort of distant ideals and places responsibility back on the individual mind. You must look. You must think. You must revise. No authority can replace that process. No system can finalize it. This is where philosophy stops being an abstract exercise and becomes an existential demand. Consider the figure of Aristotle himself, not as a distant icon, but as a function. He represents the thinker who refuses to escape. He does not deny complexity, he enters it. He does not simplify the world into neat categories. He studies the categories themselves. Through him, we see that intelligence is not about possessing answers. It is about sustaining inquiry. He is not the man who solved reality. He is the man who refused to look away from it. And here lies the deeper tension. If truth is grounded in reality, then reality becomes the arena of responsibility. You can no longer blame ignorance on distance. You cannot say truth was too far to reach. It was always here. The failure, then, is not in access. It is in attention. This creates a silent pressure within the human psyche. If everything meaningful must be derived from what exists, then every moment becomes a test. Every perception becomes a potential error. Every conclusion becomes provisional. This is not comfortable. It is exhausting. And that is precisely why so many retreat into abstraction, into ideology, into systems that promise certainty without effort. But Aristotle leaves no room for that retreat. He demands that we stay with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be, not as we fear it might be, but as it reveals itself through careful, relentless examination. And yet, even this stance carries its own limit, because if all knowledge begins with observation, then observation itself becomes the boundary. What we see shapes what we know. What we fail to see defines our ignorance. Aristotle understood this, even if he could not fully escape it. His greatness does not lie in being free from limitation. It lies in recognizing that limitation is unavoidable. This is where the tension intensifies. To ground truth in reality is to accept that reality is always partially hidden. There is no complete access, no final clarity, only deeper approximation. And so the act of thinking becomes an act of humility, not the soft humility of politeness, but the hard humility of constraint. You are not omniscient. You are not detached. You are inside the very world you are trying to understand. This realization cuts through every illusion of intellectual superiority. It forces a redefinition of what it means to know. Knowledge is not possession. It is engagement. It is not a state. It is a movement. And once this movement begins, it cannot remain confined to objects, to nature, to external things. It turns inward. If truth must be found in what exists, then the self becomes part of the investigation. Your thoughts, your reactions, your fears, your contradictions. They are not distractions from truth. They are elements of it. And this is where the next tension begins to emerge. Because to observe the world is one challenge. To observe oneself is another. Observation is not passive. It is an act of violence against illusion. Before science formalized its methods, before data became a currency, Aristotle had already imposed a discipline that most minds still resist. He did not simply suggest that we look at the world. He demanded that we submit to it. To observe is not to glance. It is to confront what is there without distortion, without projection, without the comfort of premature meaning. And that demand cuts deeper than most are willing to admit. What does it mean to truly see before you believe? It means you suspend the urge to conclude. It means you delay judgment. It means you accept that your first interpretation is likely wrong. Aristotle understood that the human mind does not begin with truth. It begins with bias. It begins with assumption. It begins with a need to stabilize uncertainty as quickly as possible. And so he constructed a method that forces the mind to slow down, to compare, to test, to verify. The first assertion is brutal. Perception is not knowledge. The explanation follows with precision. To see something is not to understand it. The senses deliver fragments, not conclusions. A single observation is incomplete, often misleading, sometimes entirely false. The common misunderstanding is that experience equals truth. Aristotle rejects this outright. Experience must be examined, repeated, compared across different conditions. Only then does it begin to approach knowledge. And the conclusion is unavoidable. What you see is not yet what is. The second assertion deepens the cut. Comparison is not optional, it is essential. Aristotle did not isolate phenomena. He placed them side by side. He searched for patterns, for similarities, for differences that reveal structure beneath appearance. Without comparison, the mind invents meaning where there is none. It assumes uniqueness where there is repetition. It confuses anomaly with rule. The misunderstanding here is subtle but dangerous. People believe that a single strong impression is enough to justify belief. It is not. One case proves nothing. One instance explains nothing. And so the conclusion sharpens. To understand anything, you must see it against something else. The third assertion confronts the core of intellectual arrogance. Knowledge must pass through reality. It cannot bypass it. Aristotle refused to accept conclusions that were not grounded in observable evidence. He did not deny reasoning. He redefined its role. Reason is not a generator of truth. It is a tool that organizes what observation provides. When reason detaches from reality, it becomes speculation. When it returns to reality, it becomes insight. The misunderstanding is widespread. Many assume that thinking alone can produce truth. Aristotle dismantles that illusion. Thinking without grounding is construction without foundation. And the conclusion stands firm. Reality is the filter through which all knowledge must pass. Now the pressure intensifies. If observation is the foundation, then the observer becomes the problem. Because the mind does not see neutrally. It selects. It distorts. It prioritizes what confirms its expectations. This is where Aristotle's method becomes more than intellectual. It becomes psychological warfare against the self. Why do we rush to believe? Because uncertainty is intolerable. The mind seeks closure, even if that closure is false. It prefers a wrong answer over no answer. It prefers coherence over accuracy. This is not a flaw in reasoning. It is a defense mechanism. To delay judgment is to remain exposed, and most people cannot tolerate that exposure. Aristotle forces that exposure. He demands that you look longer than you want to, that you question what feels obvious, that you doubt what appears certain. This is not comfortable. It destabilizes identity, because many of your beliefs are not conclusions, they are attachments. Now place this in the modern condition. In the age of endless information, observation has been replaced by consumption. People do not look, they scroll. They do not compare, they react. They do not verify, they share. The illusion is that access to information equals understanding, but access without discipline produces confusion, not clarity. In 2025, the crisis is not ignorance. It is the inability to distinguish between what has been seen and what has been assumed. Technology accelerates perception but weakens examination. It floods the senses but fragments attention. Aristotle's method becomes even more necessary and yet even more rare because it requires slowness in a culture addicted to speed. It requires doubt in a culture addicted to certainty. And so the deeper conflict emerges. To observe properly is to resist the rhythm of the world around you. It is to stand still while everything pushes you to move faster. It is to question while everything demands immediate opinion. This is not just a method of thinking, it is a form of resistance. But resistance comes at a cost. When you begin to observe without illusion, you start to see contradictions everywhere. In systems, in beliefs, in yourself. The clarity you gain does not simplify reality, it complicates it. And this is where many retreat, because complexity demands responsibility. Look inward again. The same principles apply. You believe you understand your emotions, but have you observed them or only named them? You believe you know your motivations, but have you compared them across situations or only justified them after the fact? The mind constructs narratives to protect itself from scrutiny. Aristotle's method dismantles those narratives. This is the existential edge of observation. It is not just about knowing the world. It is about exposing the self. And the self resists exposure more than anything else. Consider a simple internal moment. Anger. You feel it and immediately conclude its cause. Someone else is at fault. The situation is unjust. But Aristotle would demand more. Observe the pattern. When does this anger appear? Under what conditions? Compare it to previous instances. What remains constant? What changes? Slowly, the narrative cracks. The cause is no longer external. It is structural. It is part of you. This is where observation becomes dangerous, because it removes excuses. It replaces blame with responsibility, and responsibility is heavier than illusion. Through this lens, Aristotle is not merely teaching a method. He is exposing a discipline that most people avoid their entire lives. To see clearly is to lose comfort. To understand deeply is to lose simplicity. And yet, without this loss, there is no growth. The figure of Aristotle stands again, not as a distant philosopher, but as a function of intellectual integrity. He does not allow shortcuts. He does not accept conclusions without process. He represents the mind that refuses to lie to itself. And still, even this discipline reveals its own boundary. Because observation depends on what can be perceived, and perception is limited. No matter how careful you are, you cannot observe everything. No matter how rigorous you are, you cannot eliminate all bias. The method is powerful, but it is not absolute. This realization opens a new tension. If knowledge depends on observation, and observation is limited, then knowledge itself is constrained, not by lack of effort, but by the structure of human cognition. And this is where the next fracture begins to form. Because once you accept that even the most disciplined mind can be wrong, once you accept that even the greatest observer is still bound by the limits of his time, a new question emerges with force. What happens when a brilliant mind builds an entire system on incomplete observation? Error is not the opposite of intelligence. It is its shadow. Before the modern world learned to worship perfection, before the illusion of flawless knowledge took hold, Aristotle had already revealed something far more unsettling. A great mind does not escape error, it produces it. Not because it is weak, but because it dares to extend itself beyond certainty. And that extension guarantees distortion. What does it mean for a genius to be wrong? It means that truth is never owned, only pursued. It means that brilliance does not grant immunity from limitation. It means that the very act of constructing knowledge exposes the boundaries of the one who constructs it. Aristotle built systems that shaped centuries. And yet, within those systems, there are fractures, blind spots, conclusions that collapse under later scrutiny. This is not a failure of his intellect. It is a revelation of what intellect actually is. The first assertion cuts directly. Genius does not equal perfection. The explanation follows with force. Aristotle observed, classified, reasoned with a rigor that few could match. But his observations were bound by the tools, the culture, the assumptions of his time. He believed in geocentrism. He misunderstood aspects of biology. He constructed hierarchies that today reveal more about his context than about objective truth. The common misunderstanding is seductive. People think that greatness eliminates error. Aristotle destroys that illusion simply by existing. His brilliance coexists with his mistakes, and the conclusion lands with weight. Intelligence expands reach, not accuracy. The second assertion deepens the fracture. Error is not an interruption of knowledge. It is part of its structure. Aristotle did not stumble into mistakes randomly. His errors emerged from the same process that generated his insights. Observation leads to interpretation. Interpretation leads to system. But every step carries risk. What you see may be incomplete. What you interpret may be biased. What you systematize may solidify those biases into doctrine. The misunderstanding here is dangerous. People treat error as something that happens when thinking fails. Aristotle reveals that error often happens because thinking succeeds too confidently, and the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The more you build, the more you risk building wrongly. The third assertion strikes at the core of human limitation. Every mind is trapped inside its time. Aristotle could not see what had not yet been discovered. He could not question assumptions that had not yet been challenged. His world defined the horizon of his thought. This is not unique to him. It is universal. The misunderstanding is comforting, but false. We believe we are more advanced, more correct, more objective. But we are standing inside our own invisible framework, just as he was. And the conclusion cuts clean. You are not outside history. You are shaped by it. Now the tension sharpens. If even Aristotle, with his discipline, his method, his relentless observation could be wrong, then what does that say about the rest of us? It removes the illusion of intellectual safety. It means that no matter how careful you are, your conclusions may still carry hidden distortions. Not because you failed to think, but because you cannot fully see. Why is this so difficult to accept? Because the mind craves certainty. It wants to believe that if it follows the right method, it will arrive at the right answer. Aristotle complicates that belief. He shows that method increases the probability of truth, but never guarantees it. And this destabilizes the entire structure of confidence. Look at the modern condition again. In 2025, error has not disappeared. It has multiplied. Information travels faster, but so do false conclusions. Systems are built on data, yet the interpretation of that data remains human and therefore flawed. The arrogance is still the same. People believe that access to more information eliminates the possibility of being wrong. It does not. It amplifies the consequences of being wrong. And deeper still, error today is less visible. It hides inside complexity. It is masked by technical language, by institutional authority, by collective agreement. Aristotle's mistakes are obvious to us because time has exposed them. Our mistakes remain invisible because we are still inside them. This is where the psychological dimension becomes unavoidable. To accept that you can be wrong, even when you are certain, is to confront a form of vulnerability that most people resist. Because identity is built on belief. If your beliefs are unstable, your sense of self becomes unstable. And so the mind defends itself. It rationalizes, it justifies, it resists contradiction. Not because it seeks truth, but because it seeks coherence. Aristotle's existence challenges this defense. He shows that a mind can be both powerful and mistaken at the same time. This creates an internal conflict. Do you prioritize certainty or truth? Because they are not the same. Certainty feels stable. Truth remains provisional. Certainty closes questions. Truth keeps them open. Now turn inward again. You hold beliefs about who you are, about what you are capable of, about what the world is. How many of those beliefs have been tested? How many have been compared? How many are simply inherited, absorbed, repeated? You assume continuity. You assume correctness. But what if your internal system is built on unnoticed error? This is where Aristotle's limitation becomes your mirror. His mistakes are not distant historical artifacts. They are reflections of your own condition. You operate within a framework you did not choose, using concepts you did not fully examine, reaching conclusions that feel obvious only because they are familiar. And here lies the deeper existential weight. If you cannot fully trust your own conclusions, then what remains? Not despair, not paralysis, but vigilance. Aristotle does not collapse under his own errors. He remains one of the most influential thinkers in history precisely because his method survives his mistakes. His conclusions can be corrected. His process cannot be dismissed. This is the distinction that matters. The misunderstanding is critical. People think that being wrong invalidates the thinker. It does not. What invalidates the thinker is the refusal to be corrected. Aristotle, through the structure of his work, allows for correction. He builds systems that can be challenged, revised, expanded. This is why he endures. And so the conclusion sharpens again. The value of a mind is not measured by how often it is right. It is measured by how it engages with being wrong. Now the pressure returns to you. Can you hold a belief without clinging to it? Can you think without needing to be certain? Can you observe without rushing to conclude? These are not intellectual exercises. They are existential demands. Because to live with the awareness of possible error is to live without the comfort of final answers. It is to remain open, exposed, unfinished. And most people cannot tolerate that state. They choose closure over truth. They choose stability over accuracy. But Aristotle points in another direction, not toward perfection, but toward refinement, not toward certainty, but toward clarity that evolves. He does not offer safety. He offers a path that requires constant adjustment. And yet, even this path demands something more. Because if thought can be flawed, if observation can mislead, if conclusions can collapse, then the mind needs something it did not yet fully possess in his time. It needs structure. It needs a way to organize reasoning so that error can be traced, exposed, reduced. It needs a system that does not eliminate limitation, but confronts it with discipline. Thought without structure is not freedom. It is chaos disguised as insight. After confronting the instability of knowledge, after admitting that even the sharpest mind can collapse under its own assumptions, Aristotle does not retreat. He tightens the grip. If error is inevitable, then thinking must be disciplined. If the mind can mislead itself, then it must be forced into a form that exposes its own movement. And this is where logic is born, not as abstraction, but as necessity. What does it mean to give structure to thought? It means you no longer trust intuition alone. It means you no longer accept conclusions simply because they feel correct. It means every step of reasoning must be visible, traceable, accountable. Aristotle does not ask you to think more. He demands that you think with order. The first assertion is direct. Reason requires a path. The explanation follows with precision. A conclusion is not valid because it sounds convincing. It is valid only if it follows from premises that are themselves grounded and connected. Aristotle formalizes this into a system where statements lead to other statements through necessity, not through persuasion. The misunderstanding is widespread. People believe that strong opinions are signs of strong thinking. Aristotle dismantles that illusion. Opinion without structure is noise, and the conclusion stands firm. To approach truth, you must know how you arrived there. The second assertion deepens the demand. Logic is not about what you think, it is about how you think. Aristotle introduces a discipline where contradictions are not tolerated, where definitions must be clear, where categories must not collapse into each other. This is not restrictive, it is liberating in a harsher sense, because it removes the ability to hide behind ambiguity. The misunderstanding here is subtle. Many assume that logic limits creativity. In reality, it limits self-deception. It forces the mind to confront its own inconsistencies. And the conclusion cuts clean. A structured mind cannot easily lie to itself. The third assertion strikes at the root of intellectual laziness. If you cannot explain your reasoning, you do not understand it. Aristotle's system demands articulation, not vague expression, not emotional emphasis, but precise linkage between ideas. Each claim must stand on something. Each inference must follow from something. The misunderstanding is comforting, but false. People think understanding is internal, something felt rather than demonstrated. Aristotle rejects this. If it cannot be expressed clearly, it has not been thought clearly, and the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Clarity is proof of thought. Now the tension rises again, because structure introduces responsibility. When your reasoning is visible, your errors are visible. When your logic is traceable, your contradictions cannot hide. This is why most people resist structured thinking, not because it is difficult, but because it is exposing. Why do we prefer vague thinking? Because vagueness protects identity. It allows you to shift, to reinterpret, to avoid being pinned down. Logic removes that protection. It fixes your claims in place and demands that they withstand scrutiny, and scrutiny is uncomfortable. Aristotle understood this discomfort. He did not soften it, he amplified it. Because without this pressure, the mind drifts. It constructs systems that feel coherent, but collapse under examination. Logic becomes the tool that prevents that collapse, or at least reveals it early. Now place this in the modern world. In 2025, reasoning is everywhere, but structure is rare. Arguments circulate constantly, but few are examined. People assert, react, defend, but rarely trace the path from premise to conclusion. The appearance of intelligence has replaced its substance. Language becomes decoration, not precision. Technology accelerates expression, but weakens discipline. It rewards speed, not rigor. It amplifies voices, not validity. Aristotle's logic stands in direct opposition to this environment. It demands slowness, precision, accountability, and for that reason, it is often ignored. But ignoring structure does not eliminate its necessity. It only increases the likelihood of error. Because without logic, contradictions multiply. Beliefs conflict without being noticed. Systems fracture internally while appearing stable externally. This is where the psychological dimension sharpens again. To adopt logic is to accept constraint, and the human mind resists constraint because it equates it with limitation. But Aristotle reveals a deeper truth. Constraint is what makes clarity possible. Without structure, thought expands endlessly without direction. It becomes a field of possibilities with no resolution. With structure, thought is forced to move, to connect, to conclude. It becomes a process rather than a drift. Now turn inward once more. Your own reasoning follows patterns. You justify decisions. You explain actions. But how often do you examine the structure of those explanations? Do your conclusions follow from your premises, or do your premises shift to support your conclusions? This is where logic becomes personal. Consider a simple internal justification. You believe you are right in a conflict. The conclusion feels immediate. But trace the reasoning. What assumptions are you making? What evidence are you selecting? What contradictions are you ignoring? Slowly, the structure reveals itself, and often it reveals instability. This is the function of logic at its deepest level, not to win arguments, but to expose them. Not to dominate others, but to discipline oneself. Aristotle's contribution is not a set of rules to control thought. It is a framework that forces thought to reveal its own structure. And yet, even this framework is not absolute, because logic operates on premises, and premises come from observation, from experience, from interpretation. If those foundations are flawed, the structure built upon them can still be coherent and wrong. This is the next fracture. A perfectly logical system can still lead to false conclusions if its starting points are incorrect. Aristotle's own work contains this tension. His reasoning is often precise, but some of his premises reflect the limitations of his time. This realization cuts deeper than before, because it means that structure alone is not enough. Discipline alone is not enough. The mind can be both rigorous and mistaken at the same time. So what remains? Not abandonment of logic, but integration. Observation, awareness of error, and structured reasoning must converge. None can replace the others. Each corrects the limits of the others. This creates a more demanding vision of thinking. You must observe carefully, knowing perception can mislead. You must reason clearly, knowing logic can amplify flawed premises. You must remain aware of error, knowing certainty is always provisional. This is not a stable system. It is a dynamic tension, and within that tension, the possibility of deeper understanding emerges. But even this is not the end of the descent, because once thought is structured, once reasoning is disciplined, once contradictions are exposed, a new question begins to surface with increasing pressure. If our reasoning depends on definitions, if our arguments depend on categories, if our understanding depends on how we classify what exists, then everything hinges on something more fundamental. What exactly is a thing? A thing is never what it appears to be. It is what makes it what it is. After building the discipline of logic, after forcing thought into structure, Aristotle drives deeper into a question that most minds avoid because it destabilizes everything built on the surface. If reasoning depends on definitions, then definitions depend on essence. And if essence is unclear, then every conclusion rests on shifting ground. What does it mean to ask what something truly is? It means you refuse to be satisfied with appearance. It means you reject the surface as final. It means you suspect that what is visible is only a layer, not the core. Aristotle does not accept that a thing is defined by how it looks, how it behaves in a moment, or how it is described by others. He demands something deeper, something that does not change when everything else does. The first assertion cuts with precision. Not everything you see is essential. The explanation follows with force. A thing can change in countless ways and still remain what it is. A tree can lose its leaves, change its shape, grow, decay, and yet it remains a tree. These changes are real, but they are not fundamental. Aristotle separates what belongs to the essence from what merely attaches to it. The misunderstanding is common and persistent. People confuse attributes with identity. They believe that what is visible defines what is real. Aristotle dismantles that confusion. Appearance is unstable. Essence is what persists beneath change. And the conclusion stands firm. To understand anything, you must distinguish what it is from what happens to it. The second assertion deepens the fracture. Essence is not immediately visible. It must be uncovered. Aristotle does not claim that essence is obvious. He insists that it is hidden beneath layers of properties, conditions, and contexts. This is where philosophy becomes excavation. You strip away what can change. You remove what can be lost without destroying the thing. What remains is closer to what it truly is. The misunderstanding here is dangerous. Many assume that deeper truth will reveal itself easily. It does not. It resists. It hides behind familiarity. And the conclusion sharpens. The more obvious something seems, the more carefully it must be questioned. The third assertion strikes at the root of superficial thinking. To know the essence is to know the cause. Aristotle does not separate being from explanation. If you understand what something is, you begin to understand why it is the way it is. Essence is not a label. It is a structure that determines behavior, function, and potential. The misunderstanding is subtle. People treat definitions as static descriptions. Aristotle transforms them into dynamic insights. To define is not to name. It is to reveal the internal principle that makes a thing possible. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Without essence, there is no real understanding. Now the tension intensifies again. Because if essence is hidden, then most of what you believe you understand is incomplete. You interact with surfaces. You respond to appearances. You form judgments based on what is immediately accessible. But beneath that, the core remains untouched. Why do we settle for the surface? Because depth requires effort. It requires patience. It requires the willingness to dismantle what feels obvious. The mind prefers speed over accuracy. It prefers recognition over investigation. And so it stops too early. Aristotle refuses that stopping point. He forces the mind to continue, to go beyond the first layer, then beyond the second, until something more stable begins to emerge. This is not comfortable, because each layer removed exposes uncertainty. Now place this in the modern condition. In 2025, identity is often reduced to attributes. Roles, labels, external markers are treated as if they define the whole. But these are surfaces. They shift. They disappear. They can be replaced. And yet people cling to them as if losing them would mean losing themselves. This is the illusion Aristotle dismantles centuries before it fully emerges. He shows that what you have is not what you are. What you display is not what defines you. What others see is not the core of your being. The psychological impact of this is severe. Because if essence is deeper than appearance, then most people are strangers to themselves. They know their roles. They know their behaviors. But they do not know what in them is fundamental. This creates a quiet instability. You build your identity on what can change. And when it changes, you feel lost. Not because you have lost your essence, but because you never identified it. Now turn inward again. What in you remains when everything external is removed? Not your status, not your achievements, not your relationships. Strip those away, even if only in thought. What persists? What cannot be removed without making you no longer yourself? This is not an easy question, because the mind reaches for familiar answers. It tries to anchor itself in traits, in memories, in patterns. But many of these are still surfaces. They can shift. They can dissolve. Aristotle pushes further. Essence is not what is most visible. It is what is most necessary. It is what, if removed, would destroy the identity of the thing completely. This is where the confrontation becomes unavoidable. Because to identify your essence is to confront your own structure. Not what you prefer to be, not what you pretend to be, but what you are at the level that cannot be altered without collapse. And here lies the deeper fear, because once you see that core, you can no longer hide behind variation. You can no longer excuse yourself through circumstance. You are forced to face what in you is stable, repeated, defining. This is why most people avoid this level of inquiry, because it removes flexibility. It removes the ability to redefine yourself endlessly without consequence. It fixes something inside you as real. But Aristotle does not allow escape. He insists that without this clarity, all other understanding remains shallow. You can reason perfectly, observe carefully, and still misunderstand the very things you are reasoning about if you do not grasp their essence. Consider again a simple example: a knife. It can be large or small, sharp or dull, new or worn. These are attributes, but its essence lies in its function, in its capacity to cut. Remove that, and it is no longer a knife. The appearance can remain, but the identity is gone. Now apply this to the self. What is your function? Not in a social sense, not in a role assigned by others, but in the deepest structural sense. What is the principle that organizes your actions, your decisions, your way of being? This is where philosophy becomes personal again, because the question of essence is not abstract. It is existential. It determines how you live, what you pursue, what you avoid. And yet, even this clarity introduces another layer of tension. Because if essence defines what something is, then not everything about a thing is equally important. Some aspects are central, others are secondary. This leads to a distinction that cuts even deeper between what is essential and what is merely attached, between what you are and what you have, between what can change and what cannot. And once that distinction is made, another question begins to press forward with increasing intensity. If some parts of you can change without altering who you are, and others cannot be lost without destroying that identity, then how do you know which is which? Not everything that changes transforms who you are, but some changes erase you completely. Aristotle does not stop at identifying essence. He sharpens the blade further. If essence defines what a thing is, then everything else must be examined in relation to it. What belongs to the core? What merely surrounds it? What can shift without consequence? What cannot be touched without destruction? And in this distinction, he exposes one of the most dangerous confusions in human existence. What does it mean to separate essence from attribute? It means you stop treating all aspects of yourself as equal. It means you recognize that some parts of you are structural, while others are incidental. It means you begin to see that change is not inherently loss, and stability is not inherently truth. The first assertion strikes immediately. Change does not always alter identity. The explanation follows with force. A person can change habits, environments, opinions, even emotional patterns, and still remain fundamentally the same. These shifts are real, but they do not penetrate the core. Aristotle calls these attributes. They belong to you, but they do not define you. The misunderstanding is widespread. People equate any change with transformation. They believe that altering behavior means becoming someone new. Aristotle dismantles that illusion. Movement on the surface is not movement at the center. And the conclusion stands firm. Not all change matters equally. The second assertion cuts deeper. Some losses destroy identity. The explanation follows with precision. There are elements within a person that are not replaceable, not because they are fixed by nature, but because they organize everything else. Remove them, and the structure collapses. Aristotle forces the question, what in you is essential? What, if taken away, would make you no longer yourself? The misunderstanding here is comforting, but false. People assume they can lose anything and remain intact. That identity is flexible without limit. Aristotle exposes the danger. There are boundaries, and crossing them is not adaptation, it is dissolution. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. You can change without losing yourself, but you can also lose yourself while believing you are only changing. The third assertion confronts the illusion of self-knowledge. Most people do not know what in them is essential. The explanation follows with clarity. They identify with roles, with emotions, with patterns that are, in fact, secondary. They protect what is visible and neglect what is fundamental. The misunderstanding is subtle. People think they know themselves because they can describe themselves. Aristotle rejects this. Description is not identification. To know yourself is to distinguish between what you are and what you carry. And the conclusion cuts clean. Without this distinction, you live at the mercy of surface change. Now the tension deepens, because once you accept that not everything about you is essential, you are forced into a hierarchy. Some parts of you demand protection. Others can be sacrificed. Some changes are growth. Others are decay disguised as progress. Why is this so difficult? Because the mind prefers simplicity. It wants to treat identity as a unified whole. It resists dividing itself into layers, into structures, into priorities. Because once you do that, you are forced to make decisions. What will you preserve? What will you let go? And every decision carries consequence. Now, place this in a modern condition. In 2025, identity is fluid on the surface, but fragile at the core. People change constantly, adapt constantly, redefine themselves repeatedly. But this flexibility often hides confusion, because without clarity of essence, change becomes directionless. You shift because you can, not because you should. You adapt because it is easier than confronting what must remain. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to erode the very structure that holds you together. This is the psychological danger Aristotle reveals long before it becomes visible. When everything is negotiable, nothing is stable. When nothing is stable, identity dissolves into reaction. And yet, the opposite extreme is equally dangerous. To cling to what is not essential, believing it is the core. To refuse change where change is necessary. To protect attributes as if they were essence. This is where confusion becomes self-destruction. Now, turn inward again. What do you defend most strongly? Your beliefs, your habits, your image, your past. But are these essential or are they attachments? If they can change without destroying you, then why do you treat them as sacred? And on the other side, what do you neglect? What do you compromise repeatedly? What do you abandon under pressure? Are these the very things that define you? This is where the confrontation becomes unavoidable, because the distinction between essence and attribute is not theoretical. It is lived, moment by moment, in every decision you make. Consider integrity, not as a moral slogan, but as a structural element. If your actions consistently violate your own internal standards, something begins to fracture. Not immediately, not visibly, but gradually. You remain functional, but something essential weakens. Now consider preference, what you like, what you enjoy, what you choose in comfort. These can change without consequence, and yet people defend them with more intensity than they defend their own integrity. This inversion is the core of the problem. You protect what is replaceable. You neglect what is fundamental. Aristotle does not allow this confusion. He demands clarity, not once, but continuously, because the line between essence and attribute is not always obvious. It must be examined, tested, refined. And this is where the psychological weight increases. Because once you begin to see this distinction, you can no longer act blindly. Every choice becomes a question. Does this align with what I am, or does it distort it? Does this strengthen the core, or does it weaken it? And there is no external system that can answer this for you. No authority, no tradition, no collective agreement, because essence is not assigned. It is discovered through confrontation with your own structure. This creates a form of isolation, not social isolation, but existential isolation. You are alone in determining what in you is essential, and you are responsible for protecting it. Most people avoid this responsibility. They outsource identity to roles, to expectations, to external validation. It is easier. It removes the burden of decision, but it also removes the possibility of depth. Because without confronting essence, life becomes a sequence of adaptations, not a process of becoming. And this is where Aristotle's thought begins to converge with something even more demanding. Because once you identify what is essential, the question shifts. Not just what you are, but what you are for. Because essence does not exist in isolation. It implies direction. It implies function. It implies purpose. And if something has an essence, then it may also have a way of being fulfilled or a way of being wasted. And this realization begins to pull the mind toward another layer of inquiry, one that does not ask what something is, but why it exists in the way that it does. Nothing in nature is without direction. What exists moves toward something. Aristotle does not allow essence to remain static. Once you understand what a thing is, you are forced to confront a deeper question that cuts through every layer of existence. Why does it exist in this way? What is it moving toward? What is its completion? And here, he introduces a claim that destabilizes both ancient and modern thinking. Nature is not random. It is ordered toward ends. What does it mean to say that everything has a purpose? It does not mean intention in a human sense. It does not mean conscious planning. It means that things are structured in a way that directs them toward a certain fulfillment. A seed does not become anything. It becomes a tree, not by accident, not by arbitrary change, but by an internal orientation. Aristotle calls this the final cause, the end toward which a thing moves. The first assertion lands with force. Existence is not meaningless motion. The explanation follows with precision. If things were purely random, there would be no consistency, no pattern, no predictability. But reality does not behave that way. Forms emerge repeatedly. Processes unfold in structured ways. Living beings develop towards specific states. The misunderstanding is immediate. Many interpret purpose as imposed from outside. Aristotle rejects that. Purpose is not added, it is embedded. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. To understand something fully, you must know what it is directed toward. The second assertion cuts deeper. Function reveals essence. The explanation sharpens. What a thing does is not separate from what it is. The function of a knife is not external to it. It defines it. The function of the eye is to see. Remove that, and the eye becomes something else entirely. Aristotle binds being and doing into a single structure. The misunderstanding here is subtle, but destructive. People treat purpose as optional, as something you choose or ignore without consequence. Aristotle dismantles that illusion. To act against your function is not freedom, it is distortion. And the conclusion stands firm. Fulfillment is not arbitrary. It is alignment with what you are structured to become. The third assertion strikes at the deepest layer of human resistance. Nature is not indifferent. The explanation follows with weight, not in the sense that it cares, but in the sense that it is ordered. There is direction in growth, in change, in development. Even decay follows patterns. The misunderstanding is modern and persistent. People believe that meaning must be invented because the world offers none. Aristotle confronts that belief directly. Meaning is not invented. It is discovered through understanding the direction embedded in existence. And the conclusion cuts clean. To deny purpose is not liberation. It is blindness. Now the tension rises again. Because if everything has a direction, then so do you. And that introduces a question that most people avoid because it cannot be answered superficially. What are you for? This is not a question of career, not a question of preference, not a question of what you enjoy. It is a question of structure, of potential, of the way your capacities organize themselves toward a certain form of life. Why do we resist this question? Because it removes the illusion of infinite possibility. It suggests that not all paths are equal, that some ways of living align with your nature while others deform it. And the modern mind resists limitation more than anything else. In 2025, freedom is often defined as the absence of constraint, the ability to choose anything, to become anything, to reject any fixed direction. But Aristotle exposes the contradiction. If everything is possible, nothing is meaningful. If there is no direction, there is no fulfillment, only movements without resolution. And this is the hidden exhaustion of modern existence. Endless options, endless choices, endless reinvention. But beneath that, a quiet sense of disorientation. Because without direction, action loses weight. Without purpose, effort becomes arbitrary. Aristotle does not comfort this condition. He confronts it. He demands that you consider the possibility that your life is not an open field, but a structure with a trajectory, not imposed from outside, but emerging from within. Now turn inward again. What patterns repeat in your behavior? What capacities define how you engage with the world? What forms of activity bring coherence rather than fragmentation? These are not random. They point toward something. But the mind resists seeing this clearly, because to recognize direction is to accept responsibility. If you know what you are oriented toward, then you can no longer justify drifting. You can no longer hide behind uncertainty. This is where the psychological weight intensifies, because purpose is not a comfort. It is a demand. It requires alignment. It requires discipline. It requires the willingness to reject paths that do not fit, even if they are easier, even if they are more accepted. And this creates conflict between what you are and what is convenient, between what you are capable of and what you settle for, between direction and distraction. Consider again a simple structure. A tool that is used against its function deteriorates, not immediately, but inevitably. A blade used for something it was not designed for dulls, bends, breaks. The same applies to the human structure. To live against your direction is not neutral. It has consequences. But these consequences are often invisible at first. They appear as restlessness, as dissatisfaction, as a sense that something is misaligned, not dramatic enough to force change, but persistent enough to erode stability. And so people adjust at the surface. They change environments, relationships, habits, but the deeper misalignment remains, because the question of purpose has not been confronted. Aristotle forces that confrontation. He does not offer a list of purposes. He offers a framework. To understand purpose, you must understand function. To understand function, you must understand essence. And to understand essence, you must strip away everything that is not fundamental. This is not a quick process. It is not comfortable. It requires observation, reflection, correction. It requires that you see yourself not as you wish to be, but as you are structured. And yet, even this is not the end, because recognizing direction is only the beginning. Knowing what something is for does not mean it has achieved it. A seed can fail to become a tree. A capacity can remain unrealized. A potential can remain dormant. And this introduces another layer of tension, because if purpose defines direction, then existence becomes a movement between what is and what could be, between potential and realization, between possibility and actuality. And once that distinction becomes clear, another question begins to emerge with increasing force. If you are structured towards something, then why are you not already there? Potential is not achievement. It is a promise that can be broken. Aristotle does not allow purpose to remain abstract. Once direction is revealed, Once the structure of a thing points toward its fulfillment, a new fracture opens with force. Why is that fulfillment so often unrealized? Why does possibility remain suspended, incomplete, unreal? And here, he introduces a distinction that cuts through illusion with precision between what can be and what is. What does it mean to exist as potential? It means you are not yet what you are capable of being. It means your structure contains directions not yet actualized. It means that existence is not a fixed state, but a process. Aristotle names this tension clearly: potentiality and actuality, not as abstract terms, but as the fundamental condition of life. The first assertion lands without comfort. To be capable is not to be complete. The explanation follows with force. Every human being carries within them capacities that are not yet real, intelligence that is not yet developed, discipline that is not yet formed, character that is not yet stabilized. The misunderstanding is immediate. People confuse possibility with possession. They believe that having potential means they already are something. Aristotle dismantles that illusion. Potential is absence, not presence. It is what could exist, not what does. And the conclusion stands firm. What you could be does not define you. What you have made real does. The second assertion deepens the tension. Becoming is a process, not an event. The explanation sharpens. Nothing moves from potential to actuality instantly. It requires conditions, repetition, direction, resistance. A seed does not become a tree by declaration. It requires time, structure, environment, persistence. The same applies to the human being. The misunderstanding here is dangerous. People expect transformation without process. They seek results without enduring development. Aristotle rejects this impatience. Becoming is gradual, structured, often invisible until it is undeniable. And the conclusion cuts clean. You do not become by wishing. You become by undergoing. The third assertion strikes at the core of human avoidance. Potential can remain unrealized. The explanation follows with weight. Not all seeds grow. Not all capacities are fulfilled. Not all directions are completed. Aristotle does not assume completion. He recognizes failure as a real outcome. The misunderstanding is comforting but false. People believe that potential naturally leads to realization, that time alone will bring fulfillment. Aristotle exposes the truth. Without action, without alignment, without persistence, potential decays. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. What is not developed is eventually lost. Now the tension sharpens into something personal. Because if you are a being of potential, then your life is defined by movement, not static identity, not fixed definition, but a continuous process of becoming or failing to become. Why do we remain incomplete? Because becoming demands effort that the mind resists. It demands repetition that feels monotonous. It demands discipline that restricts impulse. And the human mind seeks ease more than fulfillment. This is the psychological fracture. You know what you could be, but you hesitate to become it. Not because it is impossible, but because it is difficult. And so you remain suspended between possibility and reality. Now place this in the modern condition. In 2025, potential is celebrated more than achievement. People speak of what they could do, what they might become, what they intend to pursue. But intention without realization becomes a form of self-deception. It creates the illusion of progress without the substance of it. Technology amplifies this illusion. It allows you to simulate achievement, to feel informed without understanding, to feel productive without producing. And so potential remains untouched, while the appearance of movement satisfies the mind. Aristotle stands in direct opposition to this condition. He does not value possibility. He values realization. Because only what is actual has impact. Only what is developed has form. But this realization introduces another layer of pressure. Because if your life is a process of becoming, then every moment carries weight. Every action either moves you toward fulfillment or away from it. There is no neutrality. Even inaction is a direction. It is the direction of decay. Now turn inward again. What capacities in you remain undeveloped? Not because they do not exist, but because they have not been forced into reality. What patterns repeat that keep you in potential rather than pushing you into action? What excuses do you construct to justify delay? This is where the confrontation becomes unavoidable, because potential is comfortable. It allows you to imagine a future without demanding that you build it. It allows you to preserve the illusion of ability without testing it. But once you begin to actualize, illusion collapses. Reality replaces imagination. Limits become visible. Weaknesses become undeniable. And this is why many stop before they begin. Aristotle does not allow this retreat. He demands movement. Not random movement, but directed movement. Because becoming without direction leads to fragmentation, and fragmentation leads to exhaustion. This is where potential and purpose converge. Your direction defines which potentials must be actualized. Not all possibilities matter, only those aligned with your structure. And this reduces the illusion of infinite choice. It narrows the path. It demands focus. It demands exclusion. But exclusion is painful because it means letting go of possibilities that will never be realized. It means accepting limitation. And again, the modern mind resists this. It wants to keep all options open, to remain undefined, to avoid commitment. But in doing so, it remains unrealized. This is the deeper tragedy Aristotle reveals. Not failure after effort, but failure through avoidance. Not becoming something and falling short, but never becoming anything at all. Now consider a simple truth. Every action repeated becomes structure. Every habit formed becomes part of your actuality. Slowly, without noticing, you are not becoming what you imagine, but what you repeatedly do. This is where the illusion breaks completely. You are not your intentions. You are your patterns. And once this is seen, the question changes again. Not what could you be, but what are you becoming right now? This is not a distant future problem. It is immediate. It is present in every decision, every repetition, every moment of discipline or avoidance. And still, even this is not the final layer, Because becoming is not only about action, it is also about awareness. You do not just act, you know that you act. You reflect on your actions. You interpret them. And this introduces something that Aristotle begins to examine with increasing intensity. Because if you are a being that can move from potential to actuality, and also a being that can understand that movement, then something in you is not merely living, it is knowing that it lives. You are not only alive, you are aware that you are alive. And that changes everything. Aristotle does not stop at movement, at becoming, at the transition from potential to actuality. He cuts deeper into the structure of the human being and isolates something that does not exist in the same way elsewhere in nature. The human does not merely act, the human knows that he acts. And in that awareness, a new dimension of existence emerges. What does it mean to possess a soul? Not in the mystical sense, not as something detached from the body, but as the principle that organizes life itself. Aristotle does not divide the human into separate substances. He sees the soul as the form of the living body, the structure that makes a living being alive. But within this structure, there are levels, layers, functions that define different kinds of life. The first assertion lands with clarity. Not all life is the same. The explanation follows with precision. Plants live, but they do not perceive. Animals perceive, but they do not reason. Humans reason. Aristotle distinguishes these layers not to separate beings, but to reveal what is unique. The human soul contains capacities beyond survival and sensation. It contains the ability to think, to reflect, to understand. The misunderstanding is immediate. People assume that being alive is enough. Aristotle dismantles that assumption. To live as a human is not merely to exist. It is to exercise reason. And the conclusion stands firm. Your humanity is defined not by your body, but by your capacity to think. The second assertion cuts deeper. Reason is not an accessory. It is the highest function. The explanation sharpens. Within the human structure, different capacities compete. Desire pulls in one direction. Emotion pulls in another. Habit reinforces repetition. But reason stands apart. It does not react. It evaluates. It does not follow impulse. It can restrain it. Aristotle elevates reason not as a moral ideal, but as a structural fact. It is what differentiates the human from the rest of life. The misunderstanding here is dangerous. People treat reason as optional, as something to use when convenient. Aristotle rejects this. To neglect reason is not neutrality, it is regression. And the conclusion cuts clean. When you abandon reason, you abandon the highest part of yourself. The third assertion strikes at the core of self-awareness. To know is to turn inward. The explanation follows with weight. Humans do not only understand the world, they can understand themselves. They can observe their own thoughts, question their own motives, reflect on their own actions. This reflexive awareness is not automatic. It must be exercised. The misunderstanding is subtle but widespread. People believe self-awareness is natural. It is not. Most live reactively, not reflectively. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Without reflection, you remain at the level of instinct, even if you possess the capacity for more. Now the tension deepens again, because if reason defines your humanity, and self-awareness reveals your inner structure, then the question is no longer what you are capable of. It becomes whether you are using that capacity. Why do we avoid thinking deeply? Because thinking disrupts comfort. It reveals contradictions. It exposes motives we would rather not see. It forces us to confront inconsistencies between what we claim and what we do. And the human mind resists this exposure. So it substitutes reflection with distraction. It replaces examination with activity. It fills time to avoid silence. Because in silence, thought begins, and thought is dangerous. Now place this in the modern condition. In 2025, awareness is fragmented. People are informed, but not reflective. They know facts, but do not examine themselves. They react instantly, but rarely pause. The capacity for reason exists, but it is underused, diluted by constant stimulation. Technology amplifies this condition. It captures attention, fragments focus, and reduces the space required for reflection. The mind becomes reactive, not deliberate, and slowly, the highest function of the human being is pushed to the margins. Aristotle stands in opposition to this drift. He does not separate thinking from living. He integrates them. To live well is to think well. To act well is to understand what you are doing and why. But this introduces another layer of pressure, because once you become aware of your own thinking, you can no longer act blindly. Every decision becomes visible to yourself. Every contradiction becomes harder to ignore. This is where the psychological weight intensifies, because self-awareness removes excuses. You can no longer claim ignorance when you see your own patterns. You can no longer pretend not to know when your reasoning exposes your motives. Now turn inward again. Observe your thoughts, not their content, but their structure. How do you justify your actions? How do you respond to discomfort? How do you construct meaning from experience? You will begin to see repetition, patterns that define how you interpret the world. And within those patterns, you will see something more unsettling. You are not as free as you believe, because much of what you think is conditioned, shaped by past experience, by environment, by habits you did not consciously choose. And yet, within this structure, reason offers a possibility. Not complete freedom, but partial liberation. The ability to question what is given, to interrupt patterns, to redirect action. This is the function of the rational soul. Not to eliminate constraint, but to become aware of it and work within it. But again, this is not automatic. It requires effort. It requires discipline. It requires the willingness to confront yourself without distortion. And most people stop short of this point. They think, but they do not examine their thinking. They reflect, but only on what is comfortable. They remain partially aware, but not fully engaged. Aristotle demands more. He demands that reason be active, consistent, applied, not occasionally, but continuously. And yet, even this is not the final layer, because reason alone does not determine how you live. You can understand what is right and still fail to act accordingly. You can see clearly and still choose poorly. This introduces a new tension between knowing and doing, between understanding and action, between the structure of the mind and the formation of character. And once this tension becomes visible, another question begins to press forward with increasing force. If you know what is true, why do you not live according to it? Knowing the good does not make you good. It only removes your excuse. Aristotle does not end with reason. He does not glorify understanding as if it were enough. He exposes the final fracture in the human condition. You can see clearly and still live wrongly. You can understand truth and still betray it. And in that gap between knowledge and action, the question of a good life emerges with brutal clarity. What does it mean to live well? Not to feel pleasure, not to accumulate success, not to satisfy desire. Aristotle rejects all of these as insufficient. A good life is not defined by what you experience. It is defined by what you become through what you repeatedly do. The first assertion cuts without mercy. Happiness is not a feeling. The explanation follows with force. Feelings fluctuate. They rise and fall with circumstance. If happiness were only a state of emotion, then it would be unstable, dependent, fragile. Aristotle refuses this definition. He defines happiness as a form of activity, a way of being that expresses the highest part of your nature over time. The misunderstanding is universal. People chase pleasure and call it fulfillment. Aristotle dismantles that illusion. Pleasure can accompany a good life, but it cannot define it. And the conclusion stands firm. A good life is not something you feel, it is something you enact. The second assertion deepens the demand. Virtue is not innate, it is formed. The explanation sharpens. No one is born disciplined, just, courageous, or wise. These are not traits you possess automatically. They are patterns you build through repetition. Every action leaves a trace. Every choice reinforces a direction. Slowly, without noticing, character forms. The misunderstanding here is comforting but false. People believe that knowing what is right is enough to become it. Aristotle rejects this. Knowledge without practice is inert. It changes nothing. And the conclusion cuts clean. You do not become good by thinking about goodness. You become good by doing it, again and again, until it becomes your structure. The third assertion strikes at the core of moral failure. Weakness is not ignorance. The explanation follows with weight. Often, you know what you should do. You understand the right course of action, and yet you do not follow it. Aristotle names this condition without illusion. It is not lack of knowledge. It is lack of alignment between reason and action. The misunderstanding is convenient. People blame confusion, complexity, uncertainty. Aristotle strips that away. The problem is not that you do not know. It is that you do not act according to what you know. And the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The gap between knowledge and action is where character is revealed. Now the tension reaches its peak. Because if a good life depends on repeated action aligned with reason, then every moment becomes decisive. Not dramatic, not visible, but cumulative. Why do we fail to live well? Because consistency is harder than intensity. It is easier to act correctly once than to act correctly repeatedly. It is easier to understand than to embody. The mind seeks peaks, but character is built in repetition. Now place this in the modern condition. In 2025, morality is often reduced to opinion. People debate what is right, but rarely commit to living it. Values are declared, displayed, performed, but not stabilized through action. The illusion is that expression equals embodiment. It does not. Technology amplifies this illusion. It allows you to signal virtue without practicing it, to align publicly without transforming privately. And so the distance between what is said and what is lived expands. Aristotle stands against this fragmentation. He demands unity. What you think, what you say, and what you do must converge. Not perfectly, not instantly, but progressively, through discipline. But this demand introduces another layer of pressure. Because to act consistently according to reason, you must confront resistance. Internal resistance. Desire that pulls away from what is right. Fear that avoids what is necessary. Laziness that delays what must be done. This is where virtue becomes struggle. Not against the world, but against the self. Now turn inward again. When you fail to act according to what you know, what happens inside you? A quiet dissonance, a subtle fracture. Not enough to collapse you, but enough to weaken you. And repeated over time, this fracture becomes structure. You become divided. Not externally, but internally. A part of you knows, another part refuses. This division is the opposite of a good life, because a good life, in Aristotle's sense, is not about perfection. It is about coherence, the alignment of reason, action, and character into a unified direction. But coherence is not given, it is built. And it is built through choices that often go against immediate desire. Consider courage, not as a dramatic act, but as a pattern. Facing what you avoid, speaking when silence is easier, acting when hesitation feels safer. Each instance reinforces the structure. Over time, courage is no longer a decision, it becomes a trait. The same applies to every virtue: justice, discipline, honesty. They are not abstract ideals. They are habits formed through repetition. And this is where the illusion of sudden transformation collapses. There is no moment where you become good. There is only a process where you become slightly more aligned or slightly more divided with each action. Aristotle offers no escape from this process. He does not promise ease. He does not offer shortcuts. He presents a structure where the quality of your life is inseparable from the quality of your actions. And yet, even this is not the final layer. Because a good life is not only about individual actions, it is about direction over time, about the overall shape of a life. This introduces a question that cannot be answered in a single moment. Are your actions forming a coherent whole, or are they fragments without unity? Because it is possible to act correctly in isolated instances and still live without direction. It is possible to possess virtues in fragments, but never integrate them into a life that has form. Aristotle pushes beyond isolated behavior towards something more demanding, a life where reason guides action consistently, where virtues reinforce each other, where the whole becomes more than the sum of its parts. This is not perfection, it is integration. And integration requires awareness, discipline, repetition, and time. But time does not guarantee it, because time can also reinforce fragmentation. It can deepen habits that pull you away from coherence. So the question returns, sharper than before. Not what you know, not what you intend, but what you are becoming through what you repeatedly do. And once this question takes hold, it does not remain confined to individual moments. It expands. Because if a good life is built through repeated action aligned with reason, then the ultimate question is no longer about single choices. It is about the shape of an entire life unfolding under the weight of those choices. Truth does not end in answers. It continues in the way you choose to see. Aristotle does not give you certainty. He removes your illusions about it. He does not promise that you will arrive at a final truth, untouched and complete. He forces you to accept that truth is something you approach, refine, and confront again and again. Not because it escapes you, but because you are always limited in how you grasp it. What does he leave behind? Not conclusions, but a discipline. Not answers, but a method that refuses comfort. He teaches you to look before you believe, to question what appears obvious, to trace your thoughts, to expose your errors, to separate what is essential from what is merely attached. He does not simplify the world. He makes it harder to misunderstand. The misunderstanding is inevitable. Many expect philosophy to resolve uncertainty. Aristotle intensifies it, but not as chaos, as clarity without illusion. He shows that to live meaningfully is not to eliminate doubt, but to think within it without collapsing. And this is where his legacy becomes unavoidable. He was not right about everything. He could not be. No mind escapes its time. But he built something more durable than correctness. He built a way of thinking that survives correction. This is the distinction most fail to see. Being wrong does not destroy value. Refusing to think does. Now the pressure returns to you. You cannot inherit his conclusions and call it understanding. You cannot repeat his ideas and call it thought. Because what he demands is not agreement, it is participation. To observe your world without distortion. To examine your beliefs without protection. To confront your own structure without avoidance. This is not intellectual, it is existential. Because once you begin to see clearly, you cannot return to blindness. Once you recognize the gap between what you are and what you could become, you cannot ignore it without consequence. Once you understand that your life is shaped by repeated choices, you cannot pretend those choices are neutral. And so his philosophy does not end in theory. It enters your life as pressure. Pressure to think, pressure to act, pressure to become. Not perfectly, not completely, but consciously. And this is where everything converges. The world, the self, the structure of thought, the movement of becoming. Not as separate domains, but as a single field where you are both observer and participant. There is no final answer waiting, no moment where everything resolves. Only a continuous demand to see more clearly, to act more precisely, to live more deliberately. And at that point, there is no longer a distance between philosophy and life. There is only the question that remains, sharper than everything before it. Are you actually living according to what you now see?